Hi, Catherine. Can you see me? Good.
I can see you, Gemma. Can you
Great.
hear me, Gemma?
Morning, Brian. I can indeed, yeah. Is that you, Brian?
Cool, good.
Yeah, good. And Colin, Mark,
Yeah,
hello.
morning.
Good morning.
Hello, Mark.
I'm actually on a ship. I'm on a ship halfway across the English Channel at the moment, so I hope my connectivity stays. But it wasn't part of the original plan. But here we go.
Morning, Colin.
Morning.
Morning.
So while we're waiting, folks, I just thought I'd just run through the questions very quickly with you all, if that's okay.
Yep.
So the first question is, what are the current and new skills we need to develop in order to equip our industry for tomorrow? I'm going to ask Colin to lead off on that one, and then I'll go through Philip, Brian, and Gemma. Then the second question is, what does the industry need to do to continue broadening diversity in people and skills? I'll ask Gemma to lead off on that one, and then come to Philip, Brian, and Colin. Then the third question, what challenges do we face when considering STCW revision before 2030? Brian, I'd ask you to lead off on that one, and then I'll come to Gemma, Colin, and Philip. And the fourth question, what is the potential for digitalization to transform industry workforce management and their development over the next 5 years? I've brought that back from 2030 because pace of that, if I was asking what we're going to be doing by 2030, I'd give you a medal and a big prize if you could tell me in terms of digitalization. But Philip will lead on that, followed by Colin, Brian, and Gemma. And what I'll do is the opening person, I'll keep you to about 4 or 5 minutes and then allow follow-ups. And that should get us through all of the questions in about 3/4 of an hour, which gives us 15 minutes at the end to be fielding questions that will have come in through from the conference and from attendees at the panel. Everybody comfortable with that?
Yep.
Yep.
Phew.
Mark, you're on mute if you can hear us, I think.
Good morning.
That's better.
Good morning,
Hear
everybody.
you
Welcome
now.
to the People Panel. I suspect that "you're on mute" will be one of the most used phrases of the last 2 years. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Stagg. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Nautical and STEM at City of Glasgow College. And I'm very pleased to be moderating the People Panel today. It's often said that people are the most important asset, and indeed, I think if you take the people out of any industry or organisation, all you've got left is stuff. I'd like to start by thanking Northern Marine Group for sponsoring this People Panel. And if I can just introduce the panellists, we have Gemma Griffin, Director from DFDS, Brian Johnson, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, Fullerton, Managing Director of Northern Marine Group, and Colin McMurray, Managing Director of Stream Marine. So good morning to you all.
Morning.
So we've got a number of questions that I'm going to be posing to the panel, and if you want to ask questions as we go along, we'll field those at the end. But what I'd like to do is we'll go through the 4 topic areas, and then we'll take questions from everybody at the end to ensure that we cover all the areas we'd like to get done in the next hour. So the first question is, what are the current and new skills that we're going to need to develop and equip our industry for tomorrow? And I'd like to start first of all with Colin.
Good morning, everyone. It's a good question, and probably one that's too easy to categorise or focus in one particular area. It's probably a blend of skills and technology. Maritime industry is a broad church. It's important to frame probably all the skill requirements in the wider industry. So, I mean, the industry's changed hugely in the last 12 months. So you look at the effects of COVID and Brexit, it's had to adapt. Some of those changes have been welcome, some of them not so much. But technology is the obvious one, and probably covers everything from basic to advanced IT skills, data analytics, engineering, research. Probably, you know, if you see some of the recent work on autonomous ships, gives us an indication of where potentially the future lies. So if you break that down into sort of probably 3 areas, you know, from a skills perspective, you're looking at sort of higher cognitive skills. So things like advanced literacy, writing, critical thinking, complex information processing. You'll also need social and emotional skills. So soft skills, if you like, advanced communication, negotiation, empathy, adaptability, and leadership. And probably leadership is a key one there. And all of these have been identified. You know, if you look through things like the McKinsey Global Report, or, you know, even through the Nautilus survey, you'll see those sort of 3 areas being echoed right the way through. So if we look at leadership, you know, we probably need to ensure that we're equipping those coming into the industry in whatever capacity have leadership skills required. You know, we make the assumptions captain's automatically a good leader because of their position, but that's more, you know, that sort of leadership's more geared towards compliance and emergency leadership. You know, it's not really having to steer employees towards targets or business goals, driving change, inspiring, delivering results. So it's important that, you know, it's a broad broad base that we give everybody in the industry, and I think that's probably the three big key areas that we're going to have to develop both for today and for tomorrow.
Thank you, Colin. Philip, is there anything you'd like to bring forward on that as well? From a Northern
yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Colin. Good introduction to some of the areas when we're looking at the skill changes for tomorrow and indeed into the future. I suppose from a shipping company perspective, we'll look ahead and what we see challenges that are coming along our way. Autonomous ships, semi-autonomous ships. We're getting towards, even from a ferry point of view, where driverless vehicles, concepts, all of these areas that we start to have to consider what sort of human talent do we need for the future. From a skills point of view, traditional training has really followed STCW requirements that look more about competency assumptions, whereby we train people on the basis that they are competent as opposed to maybe doing some sort of competency evaluations. Looking ahead to the future, definitely with more connectivity with ships, even during the discussions this morning from the panelists, there's quite a lot of focus on how we interact with the people on board today, how we do virtual ship visits, virtual audits, virtual classification, remote surveys. So there's going to be a higher competence required in the IT and the automation side of things. And I think to try and bring the competencies that are required for the future and start working on that, because as well as we know, we're looking at a longer term plan, but for the conference being focused around 2030 as an immediate target, it's not long at all. And if new training takes 3-4 years for many people, I mean, we really have to make these changes now to be ready for what's ahead of us in the future. Sustainable shipping, of course, was another topic that was mentioned this morning, and it's becoming a greater focus because it's without doubt the biggest challenge the industry has moving ahead, both 2030, 2050 requirements that are specified by IMO. And, new fuels, what fuels we'll be using in the future, what skills do we need on board to manage the vessels with this technology. We're looking at probably a change from the traditional deck engineering, segregation, more crossovers, a heavy reliance on simulator training, simulator competency, assessing this competency on a periodic basis. Still, from a skill set point of view and a company point of view, most of the training that we do is training outside of mandatory training, because there's a huge gap in the mandatory training. That means that we have to spend a lot more time doing preferred training to increase the skill sets of those on board. And I think that the mandatory training should be covering much more. And not from the traditional courses or safety courses that we've seen the STCW focuses on over the years. It should be more on definitely a competency-based criteria, and indeed a competency review that maybe takes place at 5-year intervals that other industries focus upon, whereby when people pass certificates, at the end of the day, in the maritime world, there's no further confirmation of assessment required in the future. So people do lose touch with not only what we have today, but what we have for the future.
Thanks, Philip. So I think both yourself and Colin were touching on this this theme of continuous professional development. So how do we maintain that as a lifelong theme, rather than maybe you cross the Rubicon when you get your certificate of competency and then that's it. Brian, can I come to you?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and good morning. So a very pertinent panel to be involved in, thank you. I'm chairing a subgroup on the Maritime Skills Commission at the moment, looking at seafarer training. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is some of the forming views of that subgroup. I guess we're about 2/3 of the way through our work and have had a lot of input from colleges, classification societies, and shipping operators. And in the next month, we'll be doing a focus group with past and present cadets. And the messages have been very, very consistent. And you'll recognise them from some of the previous speakers. So there are some big trends at the moment. new fuels, whichever options, and we heard Graham's perspective on it earlier, whichever options are far harder, orders of magnitude harder to handle than heavy fuel oil. That will bring about a step change in operating culture and safety culture requirements on board ships, and that brings a huge emphasis on leadership skills. And universally, the input we've had is that the current seafarer education system simply does not produce people who have the confidence in their leadership and interpersonal skills to do some of the things that are going to be required in the future. So I'd echo the point made about leadership skills. I think the second, another of the trends is increasing automation and higher and higher levels of technological agility. The shipping operators were saying were going to be required of officers joining them. So something huge about technological agility. The third very consistent theme is bound up in one of the other changes going on, which is a sociological one, and that people going to see what our shipping operators are seeing is they're spending less time during the seafaring part of their career. And shipping operators are very, very keen that we turn cadets out from the education system who are prepared not just for a life at sea, but for a career in the maritime sector. And that came across very, very strongly. And I guess just before I wrap up, I think there was a very consistent message from all of the inputs that seafarer education and the way that we deliver it is a huge opportunity for the UK, but we're going to have to get used to changing at a pace that we've not seen before in that particular sector. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. Some interesting points there. I think the point on agility and movement at pace is well made. I was at a conference not so long ago at the college, actually, where the point was made by both the UK and US representatives that the flash to bang when it comes to STCW was about 10 years, which is incredible when you think how fast we're developing. But we'll be picking up STCW a little bit later. Gemma, can I come to you?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody, from a very sunny but very cold point in the channel somewhere between France and UK on a vessel right now. But so I hope you can hear me okay. I don't want to reiterate all the points that the guys have made, very valid indeed. And for me, it's absolutely down to technology and leadership. But for me, focusing in on leadership and specifically in terms of looking at a future, there are opportunities for seafarers who want to come ashore, and indeed who we want to come ashore to be the future leaders in our organisation, whether that's in technical organisations or CEO ranks, whatever the case may be. And I think Colin made a very good point earlier on about automatically assuming that a captain makes a fantastic leader. And I think what we have to do a small body of work on is this concept of bringing somebody from the ship-based background into a shore-based wider organisation, whereby they're excellent in their field of competency, but often a four-stripe type of leadership model doesn't necessarily transfer to a suit and tie environment, shall we say, and all the different things that you need to embrace in that respect. So I do strongly believe that we need to ensure that all these fantastically competent colleagues that we have on board vessels are trained, and maybe even comes more down to coaching and ensuring that they are fully immersed in a commercial world and identify quite early on in succession planning, rather than just, interview somebody, take them ashore, put them in a leadership role and expect them to automatically be able to make that transfer. So for me, that's something that we really ought to think about formalizing a little bit more and ensuring that we do everything that we can to make these fantastic people successful in the next life cycle of their career, shall we say.
Thank you, Gemma. Before we move on from this question, I just wanted to pose a question to all of you, which is, we have ships officers who are purposely trained and developed to be competent in that role. Is there some work we should do potentially to have some form of rotational opportunities so that they're having some boots on the ground experience before this kind of leap because I think it's difficult to, it's challenging to lay the accusation at the door of ships officers that they don't transition early into the wider sector if that opportunity isn't provided to them for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and then suddenly they're supposed to do that. What's the thought of the panel?
If I can maybe come in, Mark.
Right, yeah.
Really very, very interesting question. It actually came up in one of the discussions we had the other week. And I think it was very interesting to reflect, for example, in the Royal Navy, that you go to sea, you come ashore, you go to sea, you come ashore, and there's a cyclical nature. Now, you know, recognizing there are differences between Merchant Navy and Royal Navy, big differences, but I think it did strike us that in the Merchant Navy you have a tag attached to you. You're either at sea or your at sea career is finished, and there isn't the sort of rotation that you're talking about, Mark. And I think from the input of the shipping operators that we've seen, couldn't agree more that actually giving people a more rounded, a wider early career adds real value to this, and probably would improve retention within the sector as well.
Thanks, Brian. Hopefully we'll come back to that a bit later on when we hear from the wider conference. I'd like to move on to the next question, really. And Gemma, if I could come to you and ask you, what do you feel that the industry needs to do to continue broadening diversity in terms of both people and skills?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a really interesting question. And I realise that this is in the context of, you know, what shape we're in and what we look like in 2030. But I'd like to flip that around, actually, and say it's about today for me. If we look at the state that the industry is in today, simply as a result of this ongoing pandemic that we find ourselves in, certainly in the cruise and ferry industry, we have seen significant amounts of downsizing, restructuring, redundancy, reorganisation, whatever terminology we want to use. And certainly from our own perspective, even within DFDS, we've had a significant amount of redundancies across the board, and hugely on the onboard side, on all departments. And we found ourselves in a bit of a conundrum this year in many respects, because whilst we're working really hard on diversity topics, when we looked at the of our reshaping projects this year, we, not through design, but simply through default, we are now 7% below what we were in terms of male-female gender split. So we've lost 7% more of women than we had in 2019, female seafarers across all departments. And a couple of different reasons for that is because, as anybody that works, and when you're doing programs such as this, you always want it to be as painless as possible and without any industrial issues. So often you take voluntary programs rather than compulsory redundancies, and it's very hard to control you know, who goes out unless you put some very strong principles around that. So we had a combination of factors impacting not least on women but also on other nationalities, whereby people were having difficulty travelling to and from the UK just because of the pandemic. People making decisions that actually, you know what, I'm just going to come ashore now because it's too difficult and I might not get an opportunity for a lump sum again. And so we've really had an impact on our workforce. Also from an age profile point of view, actually, which is really worrying too, because a lot of our older seafarers, who are super important to us because they've got the knowledge, they've got the experience of the vessels. Some of our guys and girls came out of the yard with these vessels, and you know what they don't know is not worth writing down, you know. And so we had this really odd situation of people with long service wanting to leave because it might be their last chance, and people quite early into their careers deciding, do you know what, it's not worth it in this kind of hassle travel type of environment we're working in, and also the risk to health and being key workers, frontline workers. So it's had a massive impact, and I'm sure that we're not unique in that respect. So I believe that if we don't take stock now, and I understand economically it's very difficult to put programs programs in place to recover, because we're all waiting for passengers to come back. And until that trigger point happens, it's very difficult to invest. But I would suggest that we need to really start looking into future apprenticeship programs, cadet programs, and start making the investment now, because in 10 years' time, the least of our concerns will be skills. It will be the availability of competent people.
Thank you, Gemma. It's always the way, isn't it, that you can spend a lot of time pursuing a strategy, and then a tipping point, a pivot point comes over which you have no control, and you then need to reconsider your strategy. Philip, I was wondering if I could ask you to pick up on this point.
Yes, thanks. I think the comments that Gemma made are obviously very valid, and when we look across the ferry and cruise industry, the ability to be more diverse with the people and the skills indeed allows greater opportunity due to the nature of the business line they're in. I think the difficulties become more obviously in deep sea fleet, where it's extremely difficult from a diversity point of view to work on, and I think all steps to encourage this should be taken. Brian mentioned earlier on that it's quite segregated really how people see the overall employment structure as well. You're either working at sea or you're working ashore. There's nothing kind of in between, and I think maybe that's also one of the areas we must focus on, is starting at the beginning, because not only is it quite siloed from an organisation point of view, those who work at sea and those who work on shore. But I think those who even work at sea, you're either an engineer or you're a navigating officer. There's not a great scope creep outside of that. So to make some of these roles more open to increasing diversity, I think has to be looked at even at the selection stage, because there's even a myth of at times on the engineering side of things that it's all heavy lifting, it's all more complicated stuff. But really what we're looking for especially when we're looking towards our senior officers on board, is leadership and capability. Of course, they have to understand the plant and the maintenance requirements and various other things, but it's not the same, how would you say, thought process that many people have had over the years of a hard life at sea. So I think there has to be even more targeting done at the entry level to dispel some of the myths and encourage greater diversity within the people, and of course within the skills. And I think that the skill set again has been too regimented. You're either on a deck profile, you're on an engineering profile, and there's nothing ever meets in between. And I think that definitely has to change, especially when we look at more complexity with automation, various other things like that. We have to get different skills, and they're not traditionally polarized in one side of the engineering structure or one side of the navigation structure. And I think, again, back to the selection recruitment side of things, we have to be looking at people who are going to join the industry and eventually come ashore and take positions, and it has to be more joined up.
Thanks so much, Philip. It's an interesting point that both you and Gemma have made, is about if we broaden the scope of the offering in terms of the pathways that you can follow, then it's more likely to attract people rather than them feeling that potentially they're joining an industry that drives them down a cul-de-sac. And even within that industry, that cul-de-sac can be deck or engine. Brian, can I come to you?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of talk, I suppose, about diversity with a small d. So diversity of thinking, diversity of ideas, diversity of background, and so on. And I think one of the interesting things, if we look on this sort of 2030 timescale, the sector is going to be in the middle of a magnitude of change, which some of the people I've spoken to within shipping have said is as big as the transition from sail to steam 200 years ago. It's absolutely enormous, and arguably there's some incredibly exciting careers ahead for people in the maritime sector. And I think again, when we were talking in our subgroup, one of our concerns is that I'm not sure a career in the merchant maritime sector even hits it to the long list of options for the vast majority of youngsters thinking about getting a qualification, a further education or higher education qualification. And one of the things I think that characterises maritime education is it's quite unusual. It's peculiar compared to other education options. And sometimes that peculiarity is a necessity, but often I don't think it is. I think it's just quirky. And one of the very strong forming conclusions of our panel is that we think the whole way that that seafarer education is carried out, we need to think about how we normalise it, how we take the peculiarities out. So to give some examples, we need to make absolutely sure that students coming into it have completely free choice about the academic institution that they go to and the type of qualification that they're going to receive at the end of it. I don't think that is quite free choice at the moment. Pretty strongly steered to particular institutions. That's completely different to other areas of education. I think one of the strengths that we've got at the moment is a broad range of qualifications earned, and we should make sure that that broad range of qualifications continues. There are very few at the honours degree end of things, and that means we exclude a huge number of potential students in terms of getting seafarer training on their long list of options. So I think, you know, keep the diversity of qualifications and introduce more options for honours degrees. We've talked a lot about broadening the education so that not only are students prepared for seafaring, which is an absolute given, an absolute must, but they're better prepared for a broader career in the maritime sector. And I put my hands up from an MCA perspective, because I don't think we've helped this in the past. But I do think we need to make sure that learning happens at a pace that suits the students. Those who are able to learn more quickly should be able to learn more quickly, and those who need to take it more steadily, absolutely the courses should be designed for them. And what I'm getting to here is we shouldn't judge the effectiveness of courses on the basis of the number of hours that people have spent in the classroom. They should be judged on the competency and capability that they've soaked up during that education. And I think one of the huge surprises to me coming into the sector has been how strongly weighted the judgment of the education system is on the basis of hours spent doing it. And I think that's a fundamental change. So I could go on and on about this and talk about postgraduate qualifications and so on, but I think that the broader point is I think seafarer education needs to normalise itself much more with other educational options, and through that become attractive to a much broader church of students.
Thanks very much, Brian. Some good points there, and I think when we look at the recruits we're getting who are coming from school, one of the issues that hampers diversity is that even within our core education system, topics like physics, the uptake by female students is far lower than by male students. So immediately we've got an imbalance in our pull-through, and I think part of it is that we're not pushing into schools enough to say, this is a fantastic opportunity, fantastic industry to get into. If you're interested, these are the topics you might want to start thinking about studying now. Can I just ask Colin if you'd like to close off on this question? Yeah,
I think there's been some very valid points there. You know, Philip's talked about the diversity in terms of routes and potentially more crossover. You know, the thinking that Brian has and some of the discussions that come on out of the MSc it's quite topical, because I think if we stretch that to the wider maritime industry, if we look at all, you know, it's probably, as I was thinking, it's probably less tree and more forest. We've kind of had the trunk of the cadetship leading to the branches in the industry, whereas now with the apprenticeships and the various entry points that we're having, it's a little bit more direct, shall we say. You know, if you want to go up that tree, you can start seeding it very early on, as opposed to having to start the career at sea. So that's interesting, and I think that probably is attracting a different type of person that maybe didn't want to go to sea but wanted a career in the maritime industry. So it's important we keep that concept going. And then it's a standard things you expect in diversity. You know, it's the organizational culture, it's how we operate. You know, it's a flexibility in the work schedule. You're going to sea for 4 months sometimes doesn't doesn't tempt people working part-time in a port or starting there may well do. So it's important we keep all of those topics open and keep trying to push it further down the path as well.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, a lot to be talking about here, and I think there's some good points coming in on the chat line at the side as well. Our next question is really about the challenges we face when considering STCW before and any changes we want to make before 2030. In some ways, we've already touched on that in some areas. But Brian, could I ask you to start on that?
Okay, yes, absolutely, Mark. I'm probably going to be slightly controversial about this, actually, because I don't think the barrier of change, and our group doesn't think the barrier of to change at the moment is STCW at all. We think we're in an ecosystem which is finding it hard to change and use the freedoms that exist currently within STCW. And to be really frank, I would include MCA within that, and we're doing a lot of work internally on how we promote change. So I think the challenge is more about how do we operate within the current constraints of STCW and make seafarer training really fit for the future. And interesting, I saw a comment on the chat group from David Carter about how do we sort out demand for UK cadets in the maritime sector. I think there's a huge opportunity here. You know, shipping is going to go through these incredible changes over the next 20, 30 years. It's going to require some serious skills, both on shoreside and seaside, to make those changes happen. There is an opportunity for the UK to start turning out some absolutely differentiated young officers who can take those roles and demonstrate those exceptional skills, differentiated skills, in helping the sector to make that change. But I think we've got a challenge, and as I say, not STCW. So one of the challenges, there's a huge network of interest groups in the sector. I think all of them need to reflect on how they're going to support change and be forward thinking. We will not recreate Britain's historical maritime strength by looking backwards. We will only recreate it by looking forwards. And I think that's a challenge to the whole of the sector in its thinking. I think secondly, we need to think about how we fund and subsidise seafarer training. I'm not sure the way the current funding system is structured encourages or makes change straightforward. So we're looking at that as a group within the Skills Commission. I think we'd like to see a much more open market environment for colleges and universities offering seafarer training, giving students more freedom to choose where they go to, and with colleges competing for those precious places at sea. And organisations like my own, and we are doing this, as I said earlier, just need to reflect on how we encourage and don't prevent innovation. So that's a big focus for the MCA. And I suppose if I had to set just 4 priorities on how we might change the way that we train, and we can do all of these within current STCW constraints. One is base judgment of education on capability, not time. And there's something there about course pace, which I talked about already. 2, bring in leadership and personal skills into the training. That's absolutely within our gift to do. 3, let's get our heads sorted on the use of simulation. There are some extraordinary discussions going on about use of simulators in the sector, and we've got to get over it and start using them to the maximum extent. And finally, let's sort out sea time consistency, dramatically improving it, potentially through tighter application of our expectations, and maybe thinking about some ongoing tutoring from the colleges whilst the cadets are at sea.
Thank you very much, Brian. A lot to be talking about there. Can I move on and maybe ask Gemma your thoughts from an STCW perspective?
I won't take up too much time, but I'll just reiterate the point that Brian made there. I honestly think it's time now in and a future technological based shipping environment, that we absolutely do need to look at competence over time spent. It's a very valid point and very, very important. And I see in the chat bar here, Steve Goslin has said, that it's refreshing to hear you speaking about that, Brian, outcomes based education rather than input based. But of course, we're in this model of STCW and that can't be changed overnight. So I do believe that we need to harness our abilities to be able to influence that and to make some changes for the future.
Thanks, Gemma. That's really helpful. It is a complex view. I think the four areas that Brian's highlighted are critical. Colin, could I ask you what your thoughts are?
Yeah, it's. I suppose the question does come back to whether STCW is meeting the original objectives. And should we be reframing it, reshaping it, pushing the boundaries? I think when we look at the skill set that is going to be required, it does come out of how we're training and how maritime colleges are working. We do need to focus on the likes of the computing IT skills, the people skills. There's going to be new fuel systems, business skills to be able to move people. So there's a whole list of things that we probably need to try and fit in. And it's, as Brian said, that the adjustment in how we're doing training, just rehashing what we've done or revisiting isn't going to change. It's a fundamental rewrite of the whole program. We do need to use the technology. We're going to ask people possibly to be semi-autonomous driving ships in front of screens. There's no better place to start learning that as a simulator. We don't learn to drive a car by sitting in a classroom. You actually drive the car. You take lessons in the car. Why do we not do the same for shipping? So there's a lot to think about there. And again, some good points are made by both Gemma and Brian.
Thanks, Colin. And finally, Philip, your thoughts?
Yes, my thoughts on STCW really go down two roads. One is what the UK can do from the STCW to improve our own training in the UK. And then, of course, what the UK can do to influence STCW for a global workforce. I think there's two separate themes here, and both are extremely important, because at the end of the day, it's the catering for what the shipping companies require, as opposed to what the training institutions look for on a homegrown basis. So I think we'll have to look at it in two different distinct ways. For the ability not to push the boundaries of STCW in the UK and make it as fit for purpose for us is actually a crying shame that we're not taking these opportunities. I think we're careering down the road at times, driving along, looking through the rearview mirror. There's just no perception of what's happening in the future, and using the skills, the people who are influencing it and having opinions on it. I think really need to start thinking about what we need in the future, and not what's been needed in the past. And the second thing is the international standing then, and what the UK's position is to try and look at the areas of STCW that can be raised in a more global scheme to enhance global seafarers. Because if we're not careful, STCW will just become the lowest common denominator across the global maritime side of things. And I think it's really important to us to take the opportunity to try and strengthen STCW, make it more fit for the future, but then have a separate capability to push the envelope for UK requirements.
Thanks, Philip. It's an interesting. I find this discussion particularly interesting because, in my mind, STCW is the minimum standard that the industry sets for competence as watchkeepers. It doesn't define the skill set of what we want from our people, and I think it's that wraparound. So I think it's not a barrier. The challenge is if we consider it and allow it to become a limiter.
That's right.
We cross that line and then we go, that's it, we've done it, we can stop now. I'd like to move on to a final question. And this is, it's a lovely lead on actually, because it looks at digitalization. And the question is framed as, what does the panel see as the potential for digitalization to transform the industry workforce management and the industry workforce development over the next 5 years? And if I could start with yourself, Philip.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I suppose we look at it in two areas again, is the industry workforce management and then the industry workforce development. I think in the industry workforce management, digitalization has played a big part already. for what's been done for the management and monitoring of our seafarers. It wasn't so many years ago that many crewing departments were full of filing cabinets stuffed full of paper copies of everybody's HR profiles, etc. Digitalization, of course, has moved that forward into some very, very useful and predictive systems that we're all using today. I think the most important area is the development side of things, because whilst the management of people is good, and I think some of the electronic certificates and electronic cards and all these things have been brought in now, it's much easier to help to check if there's any fraudulent issuing of certificates, which we know has been an industry phenomenon globally. And to stamp these areas out, of course, the digital footprint to assist with that, of course, is key. But for the development of the people, really, where do we start and where do we end in that one? I think what we have to start to do is use the data we have on people and what else happens in the maritime industry to trend. I mean, is it a case that we, from our own systems, what we do is we look at the accidents, incidents, undesired events that happen within the fleet. We link it back to people. We look back at the human behaviours. Are some people characteristically unsafe? Do we need them to regain focus to the specific training? What will aid their development? And how can we assist to match the needs of the people to the needs of the vessels? Because at the end of the day, it's the needs of the vessels that take the shape of what we need from the people. And this is where I think it's important. If you look at the development side of things, and by going through structured training and competency assessment, because if we refer back to STCW again, there's no competency assessment requirements, it's assumed competency. I think there should be some sort of refresher revalidation training, but with good transformation of systems, etc., that look after the monitoring and measurement of the crew, we should then start to look and see if there's trigger points where people may need more training, they might need specific training. They may have demonstrated capabilities that would maybe take them down to leading to a high potential for a shore career, a high potential for a senior officer role, a high potential for some sort of new responsibility that's coming up with upcoming legislation. And if it nothing else, it might just give us good knowledge for a specific type rating for different types of vessels. Is somebody more tuned into being an officer on a LNG carrier or a coastal tanker? So there's lots of different things can be used for this, but I think the capabilities to know everybody and then know the people against the industry and indeed the individual operation of the company is critical.
Thanks, Philip. A number of really interesting points there, and I think this idea of being able to track and know what the skills of your people are and what the skills needs of your people are, so that you're ready for the next event rather than the event happening and then having to train to it. Can I ask Colin your thoughts?
Yeah, I think some very good points there by Philip. So, it's going to be the technology or technological developments that are going to probably define, that the way that we employ people to do what task, what job. We're probably going to need to make sure we've got a pretty strong HR team in the business to do that. We've got to think about continuous and professional development. That's going to be multi-dimensional training. That's to define the problem, the solutions. We're going to have to adjust the workforce to match in with that. And if anything, COVID's shown how suddenly home working, possibly people didn't believe tasks. I've spoken to so many companies that would never believe they could work from home, but have found the solution. They've had to find the solution. So it shows when we're pushed into a corner, we're quite resourceful. And I think how we train people, we'll come back to that old theme of the colleges, universities. How we're going to train people has to fundamentally change, because we're going to need a different workforce. So we can't do the same thing as we're doing and expect a different output. So yeah, there's quite a bit to do. And just as Philip was saying, systems there, we brought 8 new systems, software systems into the business in the last 6 months. And it's trying to keep people, the systems coming in change things and change the process, but it's making sure people are trained to be able to use it and maximize is just as important.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, what's the old saying? First, the definition of insanity is to carry on doing the same thing and expect a different result. Thanks for those points. Can I now go to Brian?
Yeah, digitalisation, I guess, sort of really profound impact in three areas: onboard automation, onboard access to the internet, and training aids. And just cover each of those sort of briefly. Onboard automation already happening, pace of that's going to pick up. How big is full autonomy going to be? I guess that remains to be seen. I think what's certain though is we'll see more automation, smaller crews over time. That'll require higher skill levels. Much more will be done remotely. I guess more and more engine monitoring, good example, done remotely. And most crucially in this, human interventions will be rarer, but much more critical. So there's a really fundamental change in the role and the way that humans operate on board coming. I think the second one, onboard Wi-Fi access or internet access. We worked with ISWAN just recently on a study on social interactions on board ships, and it's very clear they've changed fundamentally. Much less face-to-face socialising, and there's a very Wi-Fi on board, very mixed blessing. Very good plus points, very difficult minus points. What's for sure is it makes the leadership position of the ship's officers even more crucial and even more subtle than maybe it was in the past. So I think that's part of where all of our discussion about leadership's come from. I think the other piece is onboard training and examination. Talked a lot about CPD amongst panel members, couldn't agree more. That's going to be very much a part of life. It's inevitable as technological change accelerates. And I also agree, I think requalification is also inevitable as technology changes. And being able to do that online is crucial. The MCA had a situation a year ago where we had to check the competence of several hundred officers on board onboard ships because of a problem with one of the courses. And we found a way of doing that online with some quite sophisticated tools. And that was very much the shape of things to come. And finally, of course, simulators, which again, we've talked about. Obviously, there's a lot of chat on the chat room about. So I think digital changes the shape of the role quite dramatically, but it's creating some tools that are going to be incredibly useful in the future.
Thanks, Brian. And Gemma.
Observation for me, just coming back to Philip's original point about using data about our employees themselves. And I think one of the things I'd be really interested in is, data-driven decisions. Are we really recording everything that we need to? For example, do we do exit interviews? Are we keeping digitalized records of why people leave our industry, why people stay in the industry? And is there anything that we can do with that knowledge that goes away when it's a piece of paper is put into a filing cabinet, but actually recording all of these things as an industry and understanding what it is that we need to do to develop the industry in terms of its attractiveness in the future and to be able to retain key employees?
Thanks, Gemma. It's a really fascinating topic, and the thing about data capture, I was just thinking as you were saying that, was that my experience has been that lots of organisations talk about lessons learned, but what they actually do is they acknowledge the lesson. The information that comes out of it doesn't ever seem to transition its way through to fundamental shifts in understanding or culture. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the numbers of accidents that we have that look just like the ones before. The one other area, and I'd just like to ask the panel very briefly before we start picking up some of the questions from the chat, is with digitalization, does a challenge also arrive in terms of managing cybersecurity? Because through these digitalization channels can come a threat, and we've seen it in all sectors, whether that's from universities being taken down to shipping companies having loss of data control, and the same in the oil and gas industry. What's the thoughts of the panel? Is that a skill that we need to develop in order to manage digitalization?
Yes, I think it is very much a skill, Mark, and it's even one of the areas when we talk about STCW revisions and various things like that. I mean, we have to look to the future. We'll have to look and see what our challenges are, what the risks in our landscapes are, continuously assess what risks we face in all areas. And of course, cybersecurity is one of the big areas that can be a huge influencer and disruptor to what we all do, and especially when it comes and takes the shape of what we have from an employment point of view.
Thanks very much. From a regulatory point of view, Brian, is that a concern for you, the cybersecurity threat?
Yes is the answer, and I think it'd be completely wrong to say it wasn't a threat. I guess I'd say it's still a fairly immature area, and I think the personal view, I think the IMO still has some thinking to do around helping the sector globally with a framework. But I think we're very, very early days with this, and it's something that we as a regulator are going to have to get to grips with, and internationally the IMO are going to have to get to grips with.
Thanks very much. So I think that's concluded the questions. What I'd like to start doing now is picking up some of the questions that are coming in, and anybody who wants to pose a question now, if you can start typing them in. But the hot topic of debate certainly seems to have been around simulators, and particularly the balance between simulators and sea time. I was wondering, from the panel, your thoughts.
But
Right.
very, very happy to kick off on this. I mean, of course, we've got to get the right balance between sea time and simulators, and we've talked a lot about leadership skills. And one of the fundamental differences between, for example, the airline sector and the maritime sector is a ship's officer is on board 24/7 and leading a crew or part of a crew, and so exposure to the sea time is absolutely essential. I think, though, we've also got to be really careful not to put our heads in the sand on this. Very, very many cadets feedback, and I think it's pretty well recognised within the sector, that sea time is of highly variable quality. And I was trained as an engineer. I remember spending hours and hours chipping and filing away at blocks of metal. I do question how much that really taught me. And I know many of our cadets spend hours and hours chipping away at paint on board ships and so on. And I question, given the requirements, just how much that's doing to them. Simulators provide us with a chance to put students through situations that we wouldn't even contemplate putting them through on board ships, and they create an environment where we can be sure they've had a consistent suite of experiences that they've had to manage. And I have to say, I do find the discussions in the sector about use of simulators quite frustrating. This is not one of no sea time, all simulator, nor should it be one of all simulator, no sea time. And it can't be that hard, for goodness sake, to find the right balance point between the two. Yeah. And, frankly, if we could get this one resolved quickly now and move on and start using simulators in a rather more intensive way, I think we'd be much the better for it.
Yes, and just maybe to echo on from what you say there, Brian, it's amazing. There can't be a definition given to it in a very simplistic manner on a ratio basis, and maybe that also takes us back to the bigger question of the control of training within the UK and who's actually in these decision-making criteria. Absolutely. Points, because I think it's a fundamental overhaul. We need to look to the future. We've got a great opportunity now with our changed relationship with the world to look at the UK flag and take the flag forward. And I think it's a whole-scale review is what's required to try and shape things up for the end user, which is the shipping companies in the future. And I think it's really a massive area of focus. On simulator time as well. I mean, before I came ashore, I was a chief engineer with the VLCC. You could be 35 days between ports. I can see what happens in ships. We thankfully had a good cadet training program on board the ships and tried to ensure that they were being trained to become officers for the future. I am very keen on the cosmetic condition of all our vessels. Cosmetic condition is key. But I don't lie awake at night worrying about a rusty U-bolt on deck and a cadet spending all his time trying to maintain this thing. It's people looking out the windows, people using all of their skills and their sensory perceptions, using their knowledge they've gained. You gain much more at times in high intense situations in simulators. We also look at some of the cadets who spend 180 hours in paper charts during their cadetship, and then they get a 5-day ICTIS course bolted onto the end of it. I think we really have to take a fundamental review of what we're looking at to ensure we've got the consistency and using all of the tools that we have available to us to drive the seafarers of the future.
Yeah, and just following on from what Philip said there as well, being involved in the simulator project with the MNTB, you know, we've come across some of these things, and as Brian's mentioned, the variability is one of the main drivers that took place for that course, was to try and do that sort of redress of balance. If you've got someone on ferries that's doing short sea crossings, they're going to have intense experience on the bridge of collision regulations, whereas if you get someone deep sea, just as Philip mentioned, 35 days between ports, you're going to have days with no, so there's going to be a difference in that, and that's really where it's trying to build that up so that everybody comes out with a similar type of experience, be it they've actually had it on ship or they've had it on simulator. So it is, and I think we know the cost of simulators, but we're not running these things 24 hours a day. We're not running them at the weekend, so there's plenty of scope for them. It's just trying to, you know, ships run 24 hours a day. Can we not train people to react at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, in a simulator? So we're not using everything to its full potential just yet. And I think there's a little bit more thought has to go into it, as Brian mentioned.
Thank you. Yeah, from a college point of view, I suppose the one thing I would say is that it's folding in more augmented reality, virtual reality into the simulated working space, and also full mission simulation. So instead of bridge simulators or engine room simulators, you're actually operating a vessel and potentially operating your liaison with the company as well, so that it applies at all levels. We're not just talking about cadets here, we're talking about maintenance of competence and CPD all the way through. We do a lot of work with shipping companies who are actually wanting to expose in a safe environment multiple times in a week events that they may only encounter once or twice a year, in order to allow them to move from ship to ship and route to route. Thanks so much. There's an interesting debate going on as well about how we involve parents or educate the public more about the fantastic opportunities that the maritime industry provides. Any thoughts on how we might do that? Somebody's talked about TV adverts, but I think there's also a piece about how to engage parents and schools and sixth form colleges, etc.
Yeah, I mean, having been involved in the creation originally of the Merchant Navy TV programme in 2010, and I was only shown really in Scotland, but the impact that had on recruitment at the time was absolutely huge. You know, we've moved on sort of 11 years from there, so whether TV is the right medium because it's so broken now into digital channels, but there's definitely something about parents' influence. You know, as a parent of someone who's just gone into university, you know, their university choice, their course was all discussed around the kitchen table. So these things don't go in isolation. And as again, some of the chat said, social media, you know, I'm certainly not in the same social media circles as my children, I can assure you. So there's, you know, where we would gain influence by going in is not on the parents. We've got to focus where the parents are going to be, you know, and we're probably that Facebook generation still. So there's a lot of thought has to go into that.
Okay, thanks so much. We're just about out of time now. I'd like to thank you all for your contribution. One point I'd like to leave you with, there has been debate, and I saw that Paul Little raised the issue of the potential for the UK to have a training vessel. This is a model that the US have done down, and I guess just to close, what are the thoughts of the panel on such a venture?
I'm not sure top is maybe the answer. You know, there's certainly a place maybe for training ships.
I don't think it was a tall ship that was being looked at. I think it was more about an operating vessel that provided berths for.
Yeah,
training.
no, well, sorry, I just saw tall ships being mentioned quite significantly in the side there. But yeah, a training ship, if it's done right with the right environment and the right people and the right ratios on board, will definitely have a benefit. You know, whether we can do that on scale would have to really be on point. You know, and again, it's making sure that sea time experience is both valid, relevant, and inspiring. And if we can do that, then yes, absolutely great.
I think there's a place for it like many other things, but I think maybe our priority should be to ensure that all the ships we use as training ships today to bring our cadets through, that there's much more joined up thinking to what happens in the classroom to what happens on board the ships. And we don't let the cadets go out to sea in an unstructured manner. And as Brian mentioned earlier on, some of the sea training opportunity that they have on board the ship is wasted through lack of focus and attention to what they should be prioritising themselves to become future officers in the Merchant Navy and beyond within the UK Maritime, and making sure those opportunities are used rather than a poor regime on board the ships whereby the training is of a very minor nature.
And I would absolutely echo what Philip said. I'd be in exactly the same place. Let's use what we've got properly, and let's focus on that. I think a whole lot of this is about getting the right focus, frankly.
Okay, we'll draw it to a close now. I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you for your contribution. I think it's been a really interesting and stimulating debate, and obviously a lot of interest from the panel. We appear to have lost Gemma. Hopefully that's just a loss of connection with the vessel she was on mid-channel. And I'll speak to you all soon, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.